We're going to begin recording the event, and now that I've given you some tips on live meeting, I'd like to start a survey, free survey, to find out who's in our audience. As I said, it's quite a diverse crowd, so if you could just click on the category that you feel best represents you and your interest in prisoner reentry. I realize there's probably some overlap. And you'll see the results are being registered, and looks like we've got most of you having answered. And it's pretty well spread out there. At this point, I'm going to turn things over to our moderator, Steve Goldsmith. Steve is the Daniel Paul Professor of Government here at the Kennedy School and is the director of our awards program. Steve?
Thanks, Jim, and thank you very much for your presentation. I'll do this quickly so that we can get to the speakers and the questions. We just had an overwhelming response to this conversation online. We at Harvard have been doing these for the last 6 months, and when we thought we had a 200-person audience. We maxed out at about 400 and then turned it off. So we hope the technology will keep up with the volume. I very much appreciate the leadership of the National Institute of Justice and Fannie Mae Foundation's KnowledgePlex, who are our partners here. Just briefly, to kind of set this up, as everybody in the call knows, the people coming out of prison are creating just an enormous crisis. And it's a crisis for not just the law enforcement community, but communities generally. I was a district attorney for 12 years. I spent as much time as I could seeing how many people I could put in prison. And I got elected mayor, and they all came out. So I visited them on the way in, and I visited them on the way out. And our probation and parole departments, as many, weren't equipped to deal with this. And particularly, many of the issues that HUD has taken the leadership in, Corporation National Community Service, and others, is their housing issues and their support issues and a whole range of things. So because of the interest and how important this issue is, particularly in those communities where parolees and probationers are often concentrated, we've invited real national experts to participate here. And the three presenters, I'll introduce them all at one time and then call on them in order. And first is Jeremy Travis, the president of John Jay College of Criminal Justice. President Travis is the author of But They All Come Back, Facing the Challenges of Prisoner Reentry, and his resume is up there on the board, so I won't look at it. I won't read it to you. You can look at it, but he'll talk a little bit about the national picture. He's got a very good vantage on what's happening nationally from this long involvement in justice issues, and we'll offer some observations about what might be done. Terry Donahue, the Associate Director of the Community Capacity Development at Justice, a longtime friend of many of us who were in criminal justice for an extended period of time, is really the department's expert now on reentry initiatives. And we'll talk a little bit about some of the more interesting ones around the country. Fort Wayne, Indiana has a good model, a serious violent offender reentry initiative. Weed and Seed is linked up with many of these and other best practices. And finally, we're pleased to, Jim is moving those slides even faster than I can talk. We're pleased to introduce to you Georgia Lerner, who is the Associate Executive Director for Program Operations at the Women's Prison Association. She has some very interesting perspectives about the offender's position on all this and how they look at it. So with that, President Travis, could you take us through some of the insights that you have from your national work?
I'd be happy to do that, and let me join in thanking the sponsors of this national electronic conversation, and just say I'm pleased to be sharing the presentation duties here with Steve and Terry and Georgia. My purpose in this presentation is to paint the big picture, knowing that the others who follow will bring it down closer to the ground. Steve Goldsmith started by talking about a crisis, and what is the crisis here? We have a national interest in prisoner reentry. So the first question is to ask why this might be the case. So let's just take a look at the first slide in this presentation that talks about the numbers of people coming out of prison. So this shows over a 25-year period a significant increase in two phenomena. One is the number of people going into prison. That's the prison admissions red line on the top. But what we're talking about here today is the increase in the number of people coming out of prison. So we should take from this slide the message that it's lots of people. It's now 600,000 plus. We have numbers from BJS as high as 650,000 plus a year coming out of our state and federal prisons. That's about 1,700 people a day. It's not as large as the number of people coming out of our jails, but this is the prison reentry phenomenon that we're talking about. The second lesson to take from this slide is that it's not a sudden phenomenon, that the increase has been steady over time in people coming out because the increase has been steady over time in putting people in. Here we had a nationally prominent prosecutor talking about seeing people going in and coming out, and this is what the country is now experiencing. So the reentry phenomenon is building up over time as we put more people in prison. I've coined this phrase in the iron law of imprisonment, which is if we put them in, they come out. And it's now quadruple what it used to be a generation ago. So the second slide asks, so who's coming home? What do we know about people coming out of prison? We know there are lots of them. First thing is it's mostly men, even though, and I'm sure Georgia will talk to us about this, the number of women coming out of prison has grown and the percentage of women coming out of prison has grown. But this is mostly about men. Men are being arrested, sent away to prison, and are now coming home. If you look at the demographic breakdown, it's half or so African American, about 1 in 5 or so Hispanic, about a third white. So it's mostly affecting men from minority communities. The average age is 34 years, which might surprise some people. We have an older population than we had in years past. So 34 years, so these are men coming out who are trying to reestablish themselves in a difficult labor market. They come with real deficits in terms of their skill set. They have 41% have no diploma or GED, so they're not coming out with the educational background that might be necessary for today's labor market. A lot of them have children that they left behind, so family reconnections is a very important part of the reentry phenomenon. The people coming out of prison today, and this has been true for a long time now, also have histories of being deeply embedded in alcohol and substance abuse, so they face issues of relapse. That's a very significant problem with people coming out who have basically, while they've been in prison, not had access to the drugs and alcohol that they had access to in the street. And they have other health problems as well. Mental illness is very serious, like co-occurring disorders here. And the population coming out of prison presents at very high levels all of the challenges of communicable diseases, tuberculosis, hepatitis C, HIV, much higher than the general population. So this is a profile of people coming out, large numbers of them, who have skills deficits, health problems, family issues, and are mostly men, and mostly men from minority communities. So the next question we want to ask is, so who should be interested in this issue of reentry? And it's interesting, looking at the profile of who's participating in this electronic conversation, how many of them are coming from the nonprofit community. What's giving the reentry conversation some energy, in my view, at the national level these days is not just the numbers, but it's the intersection that we're now seeing between the numbers of people coming out and a variety of different social policy domains. So we have people interested in corrections issues and criminal justice issues, and organizations coming to this conversation that weren't there before in the same numbers. The first issue that I'll return to a bit is the public safety question. So we should have at the table law enforcement, our traditional sort of criminal justice partners, because of the public safety implications. But hold that thought, I'll come back to it. But look at the opportunities for working in collaboration with the public health sectors, both people interested in physical health issues. We talked before about communicable diseases and the mental health problems of this population and the substance abuse issues. So there's room at this reentry table for policymakers as well as practitioners and nonprofit organizations that care about public health. The employment sector has a place at the reentry table. People coming out of prison have great difficulty reconnecting with jobs. Many of them had jobs. Half of people going into prison had full-time jobs. So the question is, when they come out of prison, how do they reconnect to the world of work? And employment can be a very important centering experience for people when they get out of prison. Housing is an issue. In some ways, the most basic question is, where am I going to put my head down when I come out of prison? So connecting to housing, and public housing has particular challenges because of changes in federal regulations that make it more difficult for ex-offenders to return to public housing. But the housing need is quite acute, and those who worry about homelessness issues see an overlap between these populations of people coming out of prison and those in homeless shelters. And finally, and for me, in some ways, the most important connections that we have to think about very strategically are with those who work on community development issues and work on family and child policy questions, because these families are not the ones who are intended to be punished when somebody was sent to prison, but in many ways they suffer and need to be sort of thought of as we have a reentry conversation. But I said before that I want to return to the question of public safety. Let's just look at this next chart. This is based on data from the Bureau of Justice Statistics. And the point I would like people to take away from this chart is that if you look at the bottom graph, we know, and this is pretty commonplace knowledge now, that 2/3 of the people released from prison are rearrested for one or more serious crimes within 3 years after being released. So this says in 3 years, 67.5% of the people are rearrested. And some of them go back to prison, some of them don't. But the more important reentry point to take away from this chart is that most of those rearrests happen within the first few months. If you look at the top bar on the bar chart here, within 6 months we have 30% of the rearrest of the population being rearrested. So the time right after release is a time of high risk of failure. Relapse to drug use, re-engagement with criminal networks, failures in terms of sort of ability to get back on track. So the national conversation, in a very important way, in my view, has to focus on those first couple of months and asking what can we do to protect communities and families and these individuals from failure in those early weeks and months. And the final chart I want to put up is to just say that the phenomenon that we're talking about, even though we started at the national picture, is concentrated in a small number of communities in every urban area around our country. I put up, just for illustrative purposes, a map of reentry concentrations for Brooklyn, New York. Just as a New Yorker, I like to show our own data here. And what this shows is that we have communities that are poor and struggling in lots of other ways, that are themselves suffering the high concentrations of incarceration and reentry and return of their residents, mostly men, who are now, because of our criminal justice policies, at very high levels, being arrested, prosecuted, sent away for, on average, 2.5 years, and then coming back to these communities. So to the extent that there's a community of interest in success here, it's the communities where these effects are most concentrated. And these are communities that are already struggling with other disadvantages in terms of health care and education and high crime rates and the like. So my final word is that if we think about reentry, it's not just about the systems, not just about the agencies, but it's ultimately about these communities where people are likely to be living before they're arrested and return after they leave prison. So that's a quick overview at the national level, and I'll turn the mic or the phone over to Terry Donahue.
Terry, thanks so much, Jeremy.
It was an excellent presentation, and one that really leads right into my own. What I'm going to be talking about today are essentially three different things. We're going to start with a real quick restate of the problem, just certain points, because I think Jeremy did an excellent job and very succinctly, I think, drawn the issue out. First, though, I want to just emphasize a couple of things, just so you don't forget this as we move through. Approximately 612,000 state prisoners were released in 2003, and as Jeremy has said, it's going to increase as we go through the years here. 26% of the released prisoners in 2002 were violent offenders, not just Part 1, but violent offenders. And Of 272,000 prisoners released in 15 states based on a study in '94, as you saw, 67% were rearrested within 3 years, and 22% of those were rearrested for a violent offense. And if that leaves you with a couple more points that you might want to really ponder, is that of that 272,000 we just talked about, they accounted for 744,000 charges within the 3 years of release. So we're talking about an absolutely serious problem, and I think it is something we should never take less counsel on. One of the things that I will also mention here is that we have an estimated 100,000 youth that are released each year from secure residential facilities. At this point, I don't have the figures that we get into that, nor do I have the time to go into that, but I think it's worthy that we take a look at that down the way. The communities, as we see it right now, are not prepared to provide adequate supervision and support for returning offenders, whether they're adults or juveniles, whether they're serious offenders or lesser offenders. There is resistance among law enforcement and community corrections, as well as social services and social service agencies, to see reentry as an issue that they should embrace and be responsible for dealing with. And what we do know is there's a lack of pre- as well as post-release assessment, whether that's related to education or job readiness or other needs that these particular individuals present. Today I'm going to talk about a particular site, a site that is located in Fort Wayne, Indiana. The county is Allen County. Why this becomes a site that I want to focus on is because it did help inform the Serious Violent Offender Reentry Initiative in its design and its development back in the 2001-2002 period. I want to walk through this particular program because I think it is an example of what any community can do. We must understand this preceded any national push to look at reentry or to provide funds for reentry. It is a prototype reentry initiative in the Fort Wayne area. It uses redeployed, and this is the most important thing if you take away nothing else from my presentation here. It uses redeployed supervision and support resources already in the community, and then dedicated those to the returning offenders in a particular quadrant of the city. It started in July of 2001, though development had started well before that. It is a one-year voluntary program with the option of a 6-month early release incentive for the prisoners who choose to participate in it. It focuses exclusively on the southeast quadrant of the city, an area with a population of about 52,000 people. I'm going to show you what you're looking at now is the actual city of Fort Wayne, and the pink area there is the actual quadrant. Just to give you an idea, the state prisoners eligible for early release back in 2000-2001. This was a map, by the way, and there was a series of larger maps or other maps, GIS types, that were provided to the city decision makers. And it probably was the most effective tool in getting a response and an opening for resources. First and foremost, it suggested that there were 590 returning offenders citywide, and that the majority, 63%, or 377, were going into the quadrant itself. Just to give you an idea, what we're talking about, the Part 1 crimes represented in that particular quadrant, 42%, and aggravated assaults, 42%, and homicides, 53%. When we developed these maps, and these maps looked at the entire quadrant itself, what it suggested very quickly was that there was a concentration in this area, a very high concentration. And when we overlaid this map with the map of current, for the past 2 years, in 2000, it was 99, and then 2001 and 2000, we overlaid those maps with the incidence of serious and violent Part 1 crime, it became very clear that they overlaid almost perfectly. They did actually a look at the offenders that had come out in 99 and 2000, and found that they were absolutely involved in previous days in the state penitentiary. The Fort Wayne Initiative, we'll go down here a little bit here, hold on here. There we go. Sorry. Let's go back. The control components of the Fort Wayne Initiative, I think, are unique. One, the offenders come back to the community corrections facility. Now, you understand the community corrections facility up to this point in time had served only lesser offenders that were in the community. It had agreed, and the Parole Commission had authorized the use of the offenders or use of the facility to come back into that area. The individual offender assessment was done immediately. It took a look at the risk to the community the offender might represent, their education, employment, housing, mental health, substance abuse, as well as community and family support networks that existed. They developed a reentry plan, and each offender was then not only focused on particular activities, but was assigned a series of services in the community. Each offender was put on electronic monitoring for the first 4 to 6 month period. There was intensive offender management and oversight by the community, corrections as well as parole, but also by law enforcement personnel, which had agreed to, once they saw the risk involved, had agreed to participate. Finally, there was a regular judicial review by what they developed and called a reentry court. And this was to ensure compliance with the released offenders reentry plan. That court actually meets every Friday and once a month on Thursday evenings. What the court does is actually go through the offender's progress to date. Offender will come back usually in the beginning every week, report on what has been going on. The judge will have been briefed by the community corrections staff and others that are serving the community offender reentry effort, and will deal with issues of noncompliance or failure to appear or other activities at that time. The support components of the reentry initiative in Fort Wayne are important. These, again, are existing services. These services have been opened up to the offender population. They represent housing in both public as well as private facilities. It provides remedial education through the education network in the city and the county. It also implies and develops and provides employment readiness for the offender population itself, again using the existing employment readiness programs in the community. Mental health and health services were not readily available to this community, but again, after a lot of negotiation and discussion, the services are now being provided not only adequately, but very aggressively. I might note that all the service providers had one very real concern, and that was the safety of their staff in dealing with the offenders. As a result, the actual provision of services, at least in the initial months of the offender's return, were done in the Community Corrections Center with all security provided for. One of the other concerns I think that many of the people had during that period as far as the service providers was the idea that they would be overwhelmed because of the neediness that these individuals actually exhibited. I think that was probably somewhat truthful as far as the concerns that these people do represent. As Jeremy talked about, they have many needs. But what became clear is that they can support those needs relatively well, even within their existing complement of staff and budget. They also provided, as you can see here, support systems and networks involving family as well as faith-based and neighborhood organizations. The quadrant to which they moved into, which I showed you earlier, has probably more churches per capita than any other part of the city. And the churches were actually with the very first organizations to come forward and discuss the plight of the returning offender population, and have been very active in helping support them through their various individual programs. It's interesting to note that the churches, we know this on a national level, we certainly know that Fort Wayne, are almost always the first line of contact when an offender comes back into the community, either by his family or by themselves. So they are the first ones that hear about the return, and often are the first ones to hear if there's been a reoffense or there's a violence against the family, extended or nuclear unit. Basic social skills are also provided: hygiene, dress, interpersonal relationships. These are things that we take for granted, but when many of these offenders have been away for 5 to 10 years, the transition back, even the most simple of things, is difficult to do. I think it's important to talk a little bit about what's happened as a result of this program. Now, understand again, we did not provide any federal funds to this program. This was totally developed by the redeployment of existing resources in the community. The state provided a small stipend, the authority to set up the court, the authority to have the Community Correction Center come in and serve as the primary organization to bring these offenders back was given by the Parole Commission. The fact that they actually were able to provide the authority to law enforcement to actually monitor these individuals using electronic monitoring and other devices, as well as giving them the powers to not only arrest, of course, which you already had, but the powers to search and seize. That was all given by the Parole Commission in a memorandum of understanding to the county and city systems. Some significant findings. 23% of the individuals who participated in the Allen County Community Correction Center and Reentry Court program from July 2001 to June 2003 were rearrested within 1 year of release. Now, that compares to a national average of about 45-44%. After the 31% of the individuals who participated in the reentry program for 2 years following graduation were rearrested, as compared to a national average of 55% or 59% if we were looking at Jeremy's figures. And then 34% of the individuals who participated in the reentry program after 3 years of graduation were rearrested, as opposed to the national average of around 67%, the national point. It was estimated that the program is responsible for approximately $2 million in annual savings in victim services and criminal justice costs. This information was based on an evaluation by the Indiana Criminal Justice Institute with technical assistance from the United States Department of Justice, Bureau of Justice Statistics. It compared the number of crimes committed by the participants in the reentry court program to the crimes the participants would have been expected to have committed had they not participated in the program. Let me talk a little bit about the Savory program, the Serious Violent Offender Program, which we developed and issued and set up in 2001 and 2003. It's currently operational in approximately 50 states and a couple of territories. It usually impacts 2 communities within the state. It is designed to develop a prototype. It has 3 basic components. One focuses on behind the walls, where we want the state systems to identify at least one prison where a full assessment will take place before incarceration and or pre-release to inform a reentry plan. It will provide education, substance abuse, treatment, mental health, vocational programs behind the walls. The second phase that we ask the states participate in this effort, as well as the communities, is a community supervision component. This, again, similar to the Fort Wayne model, again, which we used as a effort to inform this design, was to develop first and foremost a reentry plan for these individuals. Have monitoring, preferably electronic monitoring, take place. as well as the involvement of law enforcement and other community service agencies, remedial education, life skills, continuing assessment, and of course the availability of other services in the community. Again, we focused in this design that existing resources, not new resources, not resources paid for through a federal grant, but existing resources be made available to these individuals, recognizing that for the most part, these individuals are eventually going to be off parole and are going to have to know how to navigate the existing service systems themselves. And so if that's the case, they're going to have to learn that early on and figure their needs accordingly. The third phase was post-supervision, which dealt with just that point. Many of these individuals, as was noted earlier, do not have access to a family or extended family that actually wants them back or wants them in their lives. So as a result, churches and other organizations have to come in and want to encourage that as much as possible. We have a couple of other efforts going on in our area right now. We in the reentry, in the Weed and Seed program, we have an emphasis, particularly is going to be a very keen emphasis in 2007, to encourage the sites to focus on the returning offender population as part of their weeding efforts. That is, their efforts to control the crime activity in those areas. We also have developed a Weed and Seed VISTA initiative in conjunction with the Corporation for National Community Services. We're going to focus on 12 of our existing Weed and Seed sites and use VISTA members to help recruit volunteers and secure community resources to assist in the successful reintegration of serious and violent offenders. Our hope here is that some of the fledgling programs that are in these communities, or even more established community programs, can be strengthened considerably. A listing of the sites there is below, so you can take a look. Just to close my remarks here, as far as best practices, I guess you would say, I can recommend, based upon what we have done in Savory, what we have done in Weed and Seed, what we're going to be doing with the VISTA program, and certainly what took place in the prototype venture in Fort Wayne, Indiana. First and foremost, define your reentry problem. That is the number and location of released offenders over the next 5 to 10 years, plus current recidivism rates. I can't emphasize enough, the maps that I talked about earlier probably did more to open the doors and eyes of decision makers in both the public and private sector, as well as the state community, as to the not only the extent of the problem, but where it was most pronounced. The second piece of advice I would give is involve key control components: the courts, community corrections, parole, obviously, and local law enforcement. And I would emphasize the courts and local law enforcement, because obviously community corrections and parole are already involved to some degree in these activities, to say the least. The courts provide not only the ability to develop reentry court activities, which are very, very powerful in keeping the returning offenders in line, but they also provide a great deal of influence in bringing other community resources to the table. The local law enforcement community many times does not see its responsibilities focused on the returning offender. They often believe this is something that parole should handle or that the state corrections is responsible for. We must always remember that recidivism is talking about new crime, and that most definitely is the realm of local law enforcement. The one thing about dealing with returning offender, as far as law enforcement is concerned, is that you do know who they are, you know when they're returning, you know really everything about this population you could possibly ask for. And as they did in Fort Wayne, you can set up meetings with these people between the local commander in that district where they're coming back to and the neighborhood associations. You can talk about who's coming back, what the conditions of release are, and you can involve yourself in electronic monitoring and other activities, because we do know the vast majority of your serious violent crime over a 3-year period will come from this population. Use the support components that are in the community, first and foremost. Again, I said that before. The ones that you should focus on and have at the table from the get-go are housing, through remedial education, employment readiness group, mental health, substance abuse, and then faith-based organizations as well as other social service organizations. Many of these organizations, not unlike even law enforcement and community corrections agencies, do not see this as their job or their people. We even had federal agencies when we were putting this VORI initiative together, which was a joint multi-agency federal initiative, including probably about 12 different federal bureaus and offices and departments. At the beginning, many of these said, these are not our people, this is not our population, it is not our problem. Well, it's everybody's problem at the local level as well as the state and national level. Redeploy and coordinate existing federal, state, and local funding resources to make this happen. That's what it's going to take. You're going to move resources from one part of the community to another if you're going to have any success in getting this done. And try to limit your reliance on external funding and other types of resources. There's nothing wrong with grants. That's what we do here. That's what many of the people in the audience may be involved in right now. But those grant resources come and they go, and you can build a far better program if you start with the existing resources that will continue to be available throughout that time. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Terry. Georgia?
Okay. Hi, this is Georgia. I'm from WPA, the Women's Prison Association. We're a nonprofit that was founded more than 160 years ago to help criminal justice-involved women find new opportunities for living safe and healthy lives in the community after incarceration. WPA works with women to offer a continuum of assistance at any stage of their involvement in the criminal justice system, from pre-sentencing, during incarceration, and after release. We work with women in the community and women who are incarcerated in the city jail in New York and in the women's prisons in New York State. I was asked today to share some insights about the challenges of housing in particular for women who are returning to the community after serving time in prison. I'm going to cover 3 general areas, and then I'll be happy to try to answer any questions you have later on. I'll start with an overview of needs as defined by the person who is leaving or has recently left prison. Then I'll focus on how those needs translate into considerations for agencies that are working with former prisoners. And last, I'll touch on some of the housing options that can work for women who are returning to the community, and I'll tell you how our agency does some of this work, certainly in collaboration with many other service providers. And as a general introduction, I want to just say that it is incredibly challenging for former prisoners to find safe, affordable, permanent housing, and that we are always working on finding creative ways to collaborate with other agencies and develop better resources in our own work as well. So, when we work in New York's prisons for women, we hear directly from women. And then we also receive hundreds of letters from women and men who are getting ready to leave prison and are concerned about how they'll meet their needs when they get out. Women also come to our offices after they've been released. When these women come in, they always tell us they want to live law-abiding lives in the community and that they'll do whatever they can to avoid getting into trouble again and going back to prison. And when we ask them what they need in order to succeed at that, they tell us that they need a safe and stable place to live. And I assure you this is the top need that comes up. They tell us that they need to find a legal way to earn money and to support themselves and their families, that they have to be able to get medical care, supportive counseling, mental health services, and help maintaining their sobriety. They tell us that they want to reunite with their children and that they need to have relationships in their lives with people who can be positive forces. And then, of course, they tell us that they need to be able to meet the requirements of parole because most of the women who come out are on parole. More than a third of the 2,500 women who come to us every year tell us that they need a place to live and that this is the most urgent issue in their lives. When they get out of prison, they also need money immediately, and very few have a job or another source of money when they first get released. When a woman says to us that she needs a place to stay, there are several factors that will act to determine what options she has. First, it's always useful to explore whether she can live in the place that she lived in before she went to prison. Now, she will have been away for at least a year, so it's unlikely that if she had an apartment, she would have been able to keep it. But if she was living with other people, they might be open to her going back to that household. If she was living in public housing, she will probably be barred from returning to the public housing because of her criminal conviction. if she could go back to the home that she was in, perhaps with family or friends, it still may not make sense for her to go there, depending on whether there was a history of domestic violence, if there's illegal activity in or near the home, and depending on what her relationships are with the other people in the household. Of course, another huge consideration is whether she has a means to pay rent and how much she would be able to afford to pay. And many of the women who come out need immediate assistance with getting cash, and some of what they can get in New York City is public assistance with paying their rent. But even if a woman is eligible for this public rental assistance, it's important to remember that it will take at least a month and a half to 2 months until any money starts flowing. And if the money does start flowing, it's just a few $100s. So it's not enough for somebody to afford her own apartment. So we need to keep that in mind, that it's very hard to find something that's affordable. You know, most communities, the rents are very expensive, and there may not be any housing in the community where she would want to live. So some of what we have to do is manage expectations. She needs to think about what size apartment she needs. This is most often a concern when she wants to reunite with her children and she needs a big enough apartment to accommodate them. Living with a partner or another roommate would also affect how big an apartment she needs, and also affects the amount of rent that they could afford if they pool their resources. Now, after all of those other things have been considered, it's still likely that her criminal justice history will restrict the choice of places that she could live. As I said, she'd probably be barred from public housing and from rental assistance programs like Section 8 that would have helped her supplement the rent while she was, even if she started working and wasn't making quite enough money to pay full market rent. So as providers, we try to guide someone to think about what her choices are and then define what she would have to do in order to get the housing that would meet her needs. And even though she might come to WPA or any other agency and say that the only thing she needs help with is to find housing, realistically, there are other needs that have to be addressed in order for her to meet her housing goal. And a successful search for permanent housing will likely take several months, and it may entail using several different types of housing along the way. For example, it's not unusual for a woman to call us in crisis because she has no place to sleep that night. In those cases, it's very helpful that we could place someone in temporary and safe emergency housing, such as rooms at the YWCA, or some other place where she doesn't have to exchange sex for a place to sleep. And providing a place for her to stay helps to relieve her anxiety so that she doesn't have to worry all day about where she'll be sleeping that night. And she also has a place where she can leave her belongings. Women come home, men come home from prison with, often garbage bags full of their belongings, and it's so stressful to have to walk around in the street all day carrying everything that you own. Once the immediate situation is addressed, service providers can work with clients to come up with a longer-term plan for finding and keeping a safe place to live. We've found that these plans work best when we start by asking the client what she wants and needs. We don't promise that she'll be able to get everything she wants. We have to manage expectations so that women won't be discouraged and give up when they don't get a perfect 3-bedroom apartment in Park Slope within a month of getting out of prison, because that doesn't happen very often. We listen to what the woman wants and then engage her in figuring out what it will take to get there. So as providers, when we are trying to help a woman find safe and stable housing, we need to think about all of the regular issues that anybody thinks about when they're looking for a place to live, plus some others. Is she going to live alone? How big an apartment does she need? If she's trying to regain custody of her children, she has to take into account whether, if they're in foster care, there will be requirements about how large an apartment she has to have in order to accommodate the children before the foster care agency would release the children to her care. So all of these, that really needs to be considered when she's deciding how large an apartment she wants. Where does she want to live? We would all pick a lovely neighborhood where we'd like to live, but sometimes a neighborhood may be priced entirely out of her budget, and we, as providers, have a responsibility to encourage her to expand her geographic range. We should also encourage women to think about whether the neighborhood is someplace she can be successful. Is there public transportation? Are there schools, medical offices, grocery stores, banks, and the other kinds of services that she would want to be located convenient to where she lives? Will she have to go by high crime areas or be around people with whom she had committed crimes in the past? These are all very important considerations. Then we need to ask whether parole would approve where she wants to live. She might find an apartment that meets every one of her needs, but she might not get approval to live there because there are other former offenders in the same building. Price is a big, big consideration. We really work with women to help them be realistic about what they can afford to pay for rent. And of course, this is inextricably tied to her job and career plans and her work history. More and more, it is becoming difficult for women with, well, anybody with a criminal conviction to access housing subsidies or to get into subsidized or public housing. So people have to be realistic about what earnings they can expect and have to commit to doing what it takes to get and keep the kind of job they would need to pay rent. In many cases, women, and we have been able to help women access subsidies, but these subsidies are in very high demand and are in use, and so it's, we think best to help women plan to try to get housing that they would be able to afford by their own work. We also need to explore what else has to happen in a woman's life in order for her to be able to get the housing that she wants and keep it. She wants to live with her children and reunite with them, and she needs a job. We wouldn't just help her find a place to live. We would also want to work with her on her plan for reunifying with her children, which would include coordination with a foster care agency and the family court. And we would work with her on assessing what her job interests are, her job skills, and encourage her and help her find a job where she could start earning money, even if it's not her long-term career goal, while she also worked and making progress towards a long-term plan to have a job or career where she's making a living wage and getting benefits. Then we have to help a woman get prepared to keep her home. She might find her apartment and have a job where she could afford to pay the rent, but she still may not have had experience running a household on her own. So we really do her a disservice if we're not working with her on figuring out how to budget her money, how to time paying her bills, manage her utility use and bills, taking out garbage, recycling, dealing with noise, all of the things that contribute to successfully managing a household and being a good tenant and a good neighbor. Some of the ways that we can do that as service providers are by offering classes in basic home repair, and also by having staff continue to contact women after they have moved into their housing. Check in, see how they're doing. Even if it's just phone calls or periodic visits, it really makes a difference in helping someone retain her housing. On this next slide, I've just listed what some of the options are for women as they're returning to the community. As I said, some women come out and they are really in crisis, not knowing where they'll sleep that night. So some examples of emergency short-term shelter are things like renting rooms at a local Y, sometimes a public homeless shelter. Sometimes it could be sleeping on a friend's couch or a family member's couch, even though it's only a temporary arrangement. Transitional housing may be the next smart move for somebody, and many women may need supportive housing where there are services available on site. Sometimes these transitional supportive housing programs are targeted for people who have a common condition or need. For example, people who are living with HIV or people who have mental illness and may need some on-site case management. And sometimes this type of transitional housing is just what somebody needs in order to be prepared to move on to permanent housing. There are different types of permanent housing that are realistic options for women who have gotten out of prison. Sometimes subsidized housing is available, although, as I said before, Section 8 is becoming much more difficult to obtain, and getting into public housing is becoming much more difficult for people who have criminal convictions. Unsubsidized housing, which could be someone having her own apartment that she pays with her own earnings, or it could be, for example, a shared house situation where all of the people in the household contribute to the rent. And I'll talk about that in an example of one of our agency programs. And some women may opt for permanent supportive housing, particularly people who have, for example, HIV disease or who have severe and persistent mental illness. Being in a congregate or scattered site housing situation where there are on-site supports that help people maintain their connection to the range of services that they need could be the best choice for somebody. On this next slide, I've just mentioned examples of a couple types of the housing options available for women who would come to WPA. The Sarah Powell Huntington House is a transitional supportive family reunification program that WPA operates. where women and homeless women who've been separated from their children can reunite with their children and then receive case management, health care, health education, child care, counseling, and assistance with job training and placement as they work on finding permanent housing. Generally, women stay there for about a year, and this program has been operating for a little over 11 years, and more than 300 women have successfully moved from Huntington House into the community, into permanent housing. Another model of housing, which would be permanent, unsubsidized housing, is Sunflower House. And Sunflower House is actually a project that WPA developed in conjunction with Housing Plus Solutions, another nonprofit agency in New York City, where together we renovated a house, and now 8 women live in this house, and they manage the operation of the house. It's a sober, permanent residence. The rent is very affordable, and the women all have criminal justice histories. And since the house opened almost a year and a half ago, none of the women has had a new criminal charge, and the women who were who were still on parole at the time that they moved into the house have successfully completed parole. So we have found that for women who are interested in, who need a housing just for themselves, but who are looking for some support to maintain sobriety and the community sense of living with other people, this is a terrific option, and we are working on expanding the availability of this type of housing. Then, of course, the lion's share of housing that we help our clients connect to is done through linkages. We collaborate with a range of other providers, mental health, homelessness, HIV providers, to come up with more options for short and long-term permanent housing for our clients. That includes working with realtors, but the relationships that we have with other providers are really key to making options available for our clients. And then on this last slide, I just wanted to introduce it. It's called Thinking About Reentry Needs and Discharge Planning. This slide really represents WPA's approach to working with women who are returning to the community after incarceration. The types of help that I mentioned women saying they need, help with livelihood, residence, family, health and sobriety, and criminal justice compliance, are listed across the top. And then down the left side of the table, we've divided the level of assistance that people need into 3 phases. Survival, which would be that crisis moment or urgent need, often at the same time that someone is just getting out of prison. For example, when someone comes in and says, I don't have a place to sleep tonight. Then stabilization, where somebody is doing a little bit better and is able to focus on considering what her long-term goals are. And when it comes to housing, the stabilization phase would probably translate into somebody living in a transitional residence or having a more stable arrangement where they are paying rent or have an agreement that they can stay with a family or friend in a situation that is a positive, appropriate, safe situation for a longer period of time. And then in self-sufficiency, where a woman is really living more by her own terms and has figured out how to comply with her criminal justice mandates, is working, and is largely supporting herself, hopefully in a job where she's also getting health benefits. And in the housing arena, this translates into permanent housing, which could be any of the types of housing, and many more, I'm sure, as I mentioned. So that, I will leave it off there. That was what I wanted to share with you, and then I'm available with everyone else for questions.
Okay, we have, thanks very much. We have a lot of questions and a little bit of time. There are questions, lots of different people, but let me just, before going back to Jeremy and Terry, Georgia, just a couple of questions in particular I think that relate to you while your information is fresh in everyone's mind.
Okay.
A couple are, who's responsible for finding the resources? The reintegration officer, the parole officer? I mean, how do you improve communication, and who is it that really helps match the resources necessary to overcome the lack of skills on the part of the job applicants?
Well, our staff, I think there are a couple things. The way that our program gets funded is generally, and the majority of our funding comes through government contracts, and so we do receive support, but not just from criminal justice. We work with a variety of different government agencies, such as the homelessness system, the health, particularly with HIV-related funding, and some with corrections funding, particularly in New York City, where they will fund us to have staff working with women who are getting ready to return to the community or have already returned to the community. And so once a woman comes in to talk to us, we're really trying to get her to describe what it is that she needs, and then our staff is responsible for coming up with the range of options that's available and presenting these options and just working with a woman to guide her in making a choice. So it's, we get quite a bit of public support for the work that we do. But when it comes to matching a woman with what it is that she needs, she's really the driver in that process with a lot of guidance from us. And certainly when she first returns to the community, she's more reliant on us to help her figure out what's a realistic option.
Hey, Terry, let's you and Jeremy chime in on this. There's lots of questions that deal with who should be lining up resources. What's the role of the U.S. Attorney's Office? Who else should be out there trying to manage put these networks together so that the resources are there? I mean, the familiar, the common theme here is not enough resources, but even as importantly, fragmentation of the resources. Could each of you address in best practice models how those things get put together?
Harry, you want to go first?
Yes, I'll take a shot. Basically, we right now talked a little bit about the Fort Wayne model. In that particular case, it was community corrections and the courts and actually the mayor's office that came together and initiated that effort. They then opened it up, literally individual meetings with various service providers in the community as well as officials, including the U.S. Attorney. Now, in relation to our Weed and Seed programs, we are going to encourage the U.S. attorneys to help convene communities to do this activity. The closer, however, you get to the community as far as being a decision maker that has some control or could allocate some resources to this effort, the better you will be, because clearly you'll have a vested interest in this, which will become apparent to the others who also have vested interest in the problem.
Steve, I think you've put your finger on a very important structural challenge, which is that we don't have a clear, uniform answer to the question, whose job is it to manage successful reentry? So if you want to hold somebody accountable, who are you holding accountable? It's complicated by the fact that we have enormous state-to-state variation in a basic question as to whether somebody is even supervised upon release. So 20% of the people coming out of state prison now are just released. They just max out, and they have no period of supervision time left to serve on their sentence. So in a sort of cold and harsh sense, there's no government agency responsible for their reentry because they're not even on parole. But for the remaining 80%, where parole supervision is part of the equation, at the center of this responsibility under the current structure is the parole agency. Now, parole is in most places a state agency. It's not a local agency. So it's connected to state corrections typically, not to the local service system. So what I see happening around the country as I was looking at this phenomenon is that a number of other entities are saying, well, it's affecting us, so we need to get involved and think about it differently. And first and foremost have been mayors. Mayors, Fort Wayne's a perfect example of it, but it's Chicago, it's Boston, it's Oakland, California, Houston, Texas. Mayors have said, if this issue is affecting the safety and well-being of the communities that elect me to office, I have to play a role. So for people listening in on this conversation, I think the mayors are a potential partner that we have not tapped enough, and mayors can control access to lots of resources and are the political entity responsible for public safety and for the police. And the second is the police, as Terry mentioned in a number of important points in his presentation. If you care about public safety, you have to care about successful reentry, and police have been late in coming to the discussion, but they're now coming to the discussion saying, what role can we play? But the larger question is how to bring together a coalition of entities that can help manage all of the levers of influence over behavior here, positive and negative, that can get the results we want. So parole can play that role. Historically, it's done. I don't think it's done a terrifically good job at it, but they could play that role. I've proposed in some of my writings, as Terry knows, the idea of a reentry court. Fort Wayne is a great example of the judiciary stepping up to be a responsible manager of reentry here to coalesce those resources. But in other jurisdictions, like right here in Kings County, it's the DA who has said, I'm going to take the lead. So Joe Hines, our local DA, has made it his responsibility. So there's no clear answer, but clearly what is clear is that we need to have a coalition of a lot of partners, some of whom have not historically been involved.
There's a number of questions. Since you and Jeremy, you and Terry are, one of you is a Fed and the other used to be. There are questions here about, lots of questions dealing with federal resources. When's the Department of Labor going to decide on its grants? What's the federal initiative? Is there any federal effort as it relates to state offenders as contrasted to federal offenders? In a whole series of those with respect to federal response. And let me ask Terry to think specifically about what he would recommend. Well, Jeremy, let me ask you this question. Where, government or private, and where do you, maybe Georgia has some observations, where do you see the best models for job training and employer involvement, right? I mean, I think everyone would agree that the parole, let's call them parolees for now, that parolees need, they need help getting jobs. There's limited resources. What's created out there? What works? Who sets it up? Where would the people on the phone go if they wanted a best practice model for employer training and overtures? I'm going to start with you, Jeremy, and then ask Terry and Georgia for comments in order.
Well, connecting to the world of work is, in some cases, for some people, job number one. Others may have more immediate concerns about housing or health concerns, but for many people coming out, the connection to the world of work is the top priority. There's an important point that has been made in some recent research, however, which is that sometimes taking care of those other things first before getting a job is more important, because people need to get their feet on the ground and get their lives centered. But a returning prisoner faces a number of really difficult barriers in connecting to the world of work. There are legal barriers. You can't hold certain jobs. There are skill barriers where the skills that a person has don't line up against what might be available. There's enormous stigma against returning prisoners and ex-offenders generally on the part of employers. If you look at the data from the Urban Institute showing that of all the disfavored subpopulations, welfare recipients and immigrants and people with spotty work histories, those who are most disfavored by employers are returning prisoners. So you can work some on the employer side, on the sort of supply side of this equation, to try to change their attitudes and maybe even lift some of those barriers. But in my experience, what's needed most here is, and George touched on it a little bit in the housing context, but it's very similar, is some sort of supportive work environment that puts people to work when they're ready to go to work, gets them, gets a sort of a work history under their belt, moves them as soon as possible towards private sector employment, so they're not on the public payroll. But the work that they do while they're in the supported work environment is work that is seen as beneficial to the community. So the model that, there are really three models that I like to point toward. One is in Chicago, the Safer Foundation has a terrific history of working with returning prisoners to get them into the workforce. Here in New York City, the Center for Employment Opportunities has a wonderful track record in providing supported employment, jobs, doing public sector work. that helps get people ready for private sector employment. And in Texas, Project Rio, for me, is a model about working on the inside first with bringing employers behind the prison walls and creating resumes and connecting people to work opportunities in the private sector even before they leave, as well as when they get out. So we have a number of models. These models I mentioned are all working on the transitional employment model sort of theory here, because that seems to be what's needed because of the many barriers to private sector employment by just going out into the marketplace yourself.
Terry, or you or Georgia have employer-related comments to add, or particularly as it relates to, Terry, with you, if you see any federal participation in this issue?
Well, I think to begin with, the federal dollars that flow through a state system then down to usually county systems are the ones that if I could advise any county to look at, that would be where I'd start. The most important thing that we have seen is that starting with a very good assessment of what the deficits that offender represents, a very sound assessment, and it cuts across the employment needs as far as readiness and remedial education needs, and then the subsequent other needs. Without that, it's very hard to make a case that your particular individual offender has any more right to access to those resources than anyone else in that community. And actually, that's one of the first things that we've seen blocking access to resources is that many, whether it's a mental health clinic or a job readiness center or an employment facility or even a remedial education, community college, if you would, without that very clear understanding as to what that need is, maybe a workup by a professional of various types, you're not going to get very far. Are the resources there in the state and down in the county systems? Absolutely. Do you want to look at discretionary programs that are coming out? Certainly labor has had numerous discretionary programs. It still has others that are about to be released from what I understand. I'm not sure exactly where they stand in their particular program. Those are programs that will help initiate and develop prototypes. Again, I caution considerably, not because those aren't good resources, they're valuable assets that a community can use, but they represent only one part of the picture. And if you're going to solve the issue of recidivism, you must look at the full existing complement of resource systems in a community that's got to be brought to bear on these individuals. And again, that then opens the door to the resources. The Department of Justice at this point is, of course, still funding and still operating the Savory program. As I mentioned, Weed and Seed will be actively developing sites and encouraging them to get into the entire area of reentry. But you also run into that problem of conflicting need, and that's always one that seems to come right around the corner every time you come up. There's a lot of needs in any one difficult area, a high crime area, if you will, or a weed and seed site as we understand them. And it's not always easy for a community to come to the conclusion that that population should get support resources in the quantity they need them as opposed to others that are law-abiding citizens. And of course that's a balance that's tough to get into.
Let me ask Georgia for her response, but hey, Jim Cooney, do we have, I know that Manhattan Institute did an evaluation of the America Works Prisoner to Work program. Is that in your queue there? And you have all this fancy stuff you're bringing up on our site. Is that one of the many things you have there?
Just run the title by me again, or the name of the...
This is a test to see if you can impress 400 people with your speed. So,
Manhattan Institute, we'll get it.
yeah, the America Works is Prisoner to Work program, which I think used a little bit of food stamp money, if I recollect correctly, was evaluated by Manhattan. Georgia, what do you see from your perspective? You have the best view of this work issue.
Well, I think one thing that I would add is that in New York State, there are TANF dollars that are available to help support women who have criminal justice histories who have kids who are TANF eligible and have criminal justice histories as they prepare to return to the world of, or it's actually not returning to the world of self-sufficiency. As you said, Jeremy, often work, it's the first job ever. And so we do get some TANF support in New York to work with people and help them become job ready and support them in maintaining employment. And as an agency on the ground, what seems to work the best is to make the individual connections with employers to help them understand what tax benefits there are and other potential benefits of hiring someone who has a criminal justice history, and then also offering the additional support that the employee gets by continuing to work with our agency. Because we will continue to do employment retention work with somebody that, I don't know that I want to hire somebody if I have to provide a lot of extra attention and make sure that they're adjusting to the ways of the workplace, because it's very expensive if I'm the employer. So knowing that if I'm taking the risk on hiring somebody who I might not otherwise hire, that there is another support system out there that is regularly touching base with these new employees to make sure they're able to manage their schedules, to check on, how they're doing, how they're managing potential conflicts in the workplace. Employers have been open to hiring people, and we have gotten, it's really on a small scale reaching out to employers and then getting them to buy into the idea that it can work for them to hire people who can do this work and who happen to have a criminal justice history. And there is tremendous emphasis being placed on getting anybody who's had public assistance back to work. And so in New York, we are really trying to there are resources available to try to help women become ready.
That's good.
A lot of what has to happen, though, is to get people ready for the idea of going to work and to get people to decide that work is something that they value on a regular basis. It is not necessarily something that is innate for everybody. It's not necessarily how they experience life up until that point. So it's important to not just put people in a job just to have a job. It helps when people can think about what they like to do and find some kind of work that is interesting, and at some level they feel like they're making a contribution that means more than just getting a paycheck.
That's good, and I appreciate your comments. And congratulations, Jim, on the speed with which you put up the Manhattan Institute study. It was
Very impressive.
We like to be responsive over here.
It was good. Let me pick up another category of questions here. Terry, when I was at your Weed and Seed conference out in L.A. with what seemed like a couple thousand folks, it seemed like a very high percentage of the folks in the audience were faith-based in one way or another. Either their faith organization was part of a community organization, they were on the Weed and Seed Advisory Council or the like. What do you see with respect to specific participation of faith groups, either through Weed and Seed or, kind of set Jeremy up as well? Maybe somebody's done some analysis of how prison fellowship programs provide some transition continuum for folks getting out with respect to jobs. So let's deal for the next 10 minutes or so with faith efforts and what role they play. And I'll begin with you, Terry, then go to Jeremy.
All right. What we've seen is that the faith, again, I talked a little bit earlier about the fact the faith community is almost always the first one to find out that the offender's back in town. Not always in the sense that the offender gets in touch with them, but the immediate family or people who know them who don't necessarily want the offender back in town is calling for help, and they turn to the faith community, which is just a reality. The faith community is many times highly represented in these high-risk areas. What I have seen them do, and Texas is an excellent example of a program that was developed down in the Sugar Land prison area outside Houston. It was called Interchange, and what they basically were responsible for doing was bringing faith-based organizations into the prison before the men would be released, and helping set up a plan, literally a plan, to bring them back into the community. And that plan included, obviously, the housing and education needs, as well as other types of activities, but also unification with a support group. And sometimes, if it wasn't family, it would be one they would create through the faith community that the prisoner felt most comfortable with. The faith community, probably more than any other organization within the local area, is most able to recognize the need and reach out to the people in the church community, whether it's in their specific church or not, to actually get involved in helping in basic needs for the offender. I would definitely say that at this point, the faith communities that we have seen get awfully aggressive, and this is good. I don't mean to imply that. It's very, very good in the sense of going back into the prisons, working when they come back out, and providing mentoring services as well as immediate housing services and also even employment resources through their congregation. So I would say that the faith community is probably the most viable immediate resource that should be tapped if I was developing an offender reentry program in a community. And they're usually very committed. And that is not unique to any one particular faith, but almost all faiths are very committed to the fact that if you don't serve these people, they will end up victimizing the community, but they also have every right to come back in the community and try to change their lives. And that's a very healthy balance, I think, as an end viewpoint.
Steve, I think the question that you pose is a very important one, very complicated one. I want to encourage people to think about this on three different levels. So at the national level, the role of the faith institutions in advocacy in Congress and elsewhere. Secondly, in the way that Terry was talking about it as a sort of institutional partnership in managing reentry, but third on the individual level of the individual prisoner. First, at the national level, I have applauded and do applaud the role of organizations that represent faith institutions, the faith sector, in some of their advocacy at the congressional level and elsewhere on behalf of prison reform and reentry in particular. The faith community was an important partner, and maybe some would say the most important prime mover in the Prison Rape Elimination Act that was passed by Congress a couple of years ago. And similarly, we're seeing now in the Second Chance Act of 2005, which has been introduced in both House and Senate, and hearings were held in the House last week, and the Senate will be scheduling them soon. The coalition, a very broad coalition that represents both ends of the political spectrum and lots of different perspectives. The coalition that is supporting the Second Chance Act of 2005 includes as very important partners Prison Fellowship, Pat Nolan particularly, and others, church organizations and other religious organizations. And at the national level, what I saw when I was focusing most of my time and energy on this is that the presence of those institutions, those organizations at the table helped enormously because they brought a very human perspective to the questions of reentry. The faith community talks in language that is very relevant here about redemption, about giving a second chance, about hating the sin but loving the sinner. These are important concepts when we think about reentry as ways to imagine a different way of approaching a population that historically has been stigmatized and excluded from our society. So the national participation of these institutions has been very important. At the institutional level, what Terry was talking about is absolutely relevant because faith institutions have the potential to be a bridge across the prison walls. They can start work inside with the population and be the welcoming party that welcomes people back home on the outside. And this has great potential, untapped potential, and states and communities would be well advised to look at models around the country and to replicate those models. I do, however, want to just throw a word of caution here, which is that in my work at the community level and working with the faith community, this is not an easy conversation, even though it might be natural in a sort of doctrinal sense. It's not easy conversation because many of the people that we're talking about coming out of prison have been engaged in very serious acts of antisocial behavior and are not necessarily welcomed back with open arms. And so I found that there's a conflict that a minister or a rabbi or leader of a local mosque has to work through a lot of difficult community questions about why should our institution be stepping up to the plate for this population. Not to say it can't happen, and that it hasn't happened, but it's not always easy. And finally, at the individual level, there's a literature on the faith factor that would suggest that either the discovery or rediscovery of what spiritual roots can be an important part of getting ready for return home, an important part of the transition and sort of keeping a sort of a clean, clear mind and thinking about setting off on a different path. So whether that comes through organized religion or comes through self-study or comes through a variety of different religious traditions, ranging from Muslim to evangelical Christian, on some level, that's less important than the fact that this is a way for people to get centered and to get a clear mind, clear conscience as they embark on what's a very difficult journey by any measure.
Good. Let me do a couple of things here before we lose some audience members at the 90-minute mark. I want to run through some really short questions about resources. Maureen, let me ask, though, you and Jim, there's several questions here about is there a sharing forum, a chat or a blog for best practices? People are on the phone who want to talk to each other, and B, where can I find the slides and other stuff? So I know you did this at the beginning, but could you or Jim just tell the audience a little bit how they talk to each other when the call is over electronically, where they get these materials, and I'm going to come back to some questions.
Sure. Well, we have our event today is being recorded, and it will be archived on both our site, the Government Innovators Network, and on KnowledgePlex's website. And the slides will be available there as well. And on the Government Innovators Network, we're also going to be hosting a discussion board or discussion forum, which is titled Prisoner Reentry, so it's easy to find, and anybody who likes, whether they attended this conference or not, can go in there and either post replies to a discussion that's already in progress, or they can start a completely new topic if they have a question they want to pose or just a thought-provoking, insight into prisoner reentry.
When you're done and when we're still doing questions, would you put up that link one more time on the screen so people know after the call kind of where to go find it?
Sure.
And then, so Jim, is the same answer both with respect to the resources and the conversation? You go through the same link to get to both of them?
You come to our site, the innovations.harvard.edu site, and we'll show people how to get to both places.
Okay. Let me just ask a couple other really brief questions. Several questions on the Fort Wayne project. Where do we get a little bit more? There was a redeployment of parole staff. Who was moved? How did that happen? Terry, as briefly as you can, where would somebody go to get more information about Fort Wayne?
Well, I think the best place to go would be to the Community Corrections Center, and I would direct the questions to the Executive Director there, Sheila Hudson. She is managing that program through the Community Corrections Center. Both she and John Surbeck, as well as others in the community there, would be able to answer probably just about any of those questions at this point. And they've been very good about opening up their program for people who want to come by and see the effort, particularly the community court in action, as well as the delivery of services in their center. Good.
Terry, you or Jeremy, know where somebody would get statistics for Native Americans? Anybody have any Native American? If anybody's on the chat and can't talk and has the answer to that, there's a listener out there looking for statistics on Native Americans. Either one of you know where to go get those?
The first place I would look would be the Bureau of Justice Statistics, which is part of the Justice Department.
that's where we would start too.
Children of prisoners, been a concern of the President's. I'm associated with the Corporation for National Community Service, initiative of ours. Wilson Good, where any of the speakers, where do we get best practice information on children of prisoners?
I would suggest the Child Welfare League of America, and their website is just cwla.org.
And where would you send somebody, Georgia, who wants to look at the? There's a fair amount of activity in this area now. Do you have a jurisdiction or a program that you've aware of that you think particularly highly of that helps support children of prisoners? Anybody? We've got several that we're doing at the Corporation for National Community Service. We'll put Jim Marine will get some of those and put them up on our website as well.
I would recommend that through the Office of Justice programs, we have a number of contractors that might be available, and if they would want to contact our agency here, either through the Executive Office of Weed and Seed, which is really the Community Capacity Development Office, we could help bring that technical assistance resource or advice as to certain types of reentry efforts, working with the Bureau of Justice Assistance, National Institute of Justice, as well as some of our other federal agency counterparts. So we'd be glad to help do that.
Yeah, maybe you could send some of that information over to link it to that same site too. That'd be helpful. What any of the three of you? Let's ask a question about the victims, right? Victim impact statements. Victims being right to be informed before the parolees are released. What happens when you get a person's committed a really bad crime, who's got a really good attitude, and victims in the way? Any experience on any of the three of you with that?
Let me take a stab at this. I think the victim's voice is an important voice to be heard at around reentry planning. It's a little different from what you were suggesting, Steve, which is the victim's voice at the time of a decision whether to release somebody or not. And different states have different statutes about whether the victim is allowed to or encouraged to or is authorized to have standing to argue for or against parole release. But once the release decision is inevitable, however you get there, it's important for people planning the release to have a awareness of the potential for victim involvement. For example, in some cases, there's a risk to the victim when the person comes out, and law enforcement and others have to be cognizant of that. And as you're developing what is we might call a safety plan for every person coming out of prison, how we're going to keep that person from reoffending and getting back into trouble. In many cases, that will involve some attention to the victim of the original crime. But in a broader sense, the victim-serving organizations have I think, a legitimate role in this reentry conversation. They know a lot about safety issues. They know a lot about the sensitivity of the victim's community. If you're planning, for example, to think about releasing people charged with sex offenses or people who have histories of particular types of criminal behavior, victims can, not necessarily individual victims, but victim-serving organizations can be part of that strategic conversation, that policy conversation, and people planning reentry services would be well advised to reach out to that resource.
I think most of the reentry programs that we've seen developed all throughout the United States, most victim agencies are very welcomed to the development stage, and most of them want to be there because they feel that in controlled reentry, that being recognition of the victims as well as other needs and services that the offender as well as the community is going to exhibit in this process is something that's got to be taken care of right away. And it starts with the victim, because you can and you often do see re-victimization take place on a regular basis. And so controlled reentry program that starts with protection in that arena is best for both the victim, obviously, as well as the returning offender. And most victim agencies recognize that, I think, from all that we've been able to determine.
Let me do this. I've got lots of questions left. I think what I'll do is make a comment, and I'm going to read about 5 or 6 questions, and then ask each of the 3 panelists to pick whichever of those they wish to respond to and make their closing comments, so that we can. I'll just throw out 5 or 6 questions and then call on Jeremy, Terry, and George in order. Let me just say one of them is a question about what can you expect from your local mayor, which I think I take personally. I'm not. I would suggest the following. You know, our Innovations program put out a little book called Governing by Network, A New Face of the Public Sector. And in that book, we took the position that governments moved from a bureaucratic model to a model where a government actor initiates a network of resources. So instead of telling your public employees what to do, or telling your parole officers what to do, or telling your correction officers what to do, you say, all right, I've got some money, I have some rhetoric, I have a lot of authority. How do I use those assets to create a network? Now, inherently in the presentation of our 3 speakers is the proposition that it's going to take this weaving together of these services. So I just say that because that can be done by the chief judge, can be done by the employment agency, but in many cities, especially those cities where lots of offenders are coming back in very concentrated neighborhoods, I think it's legitimate to say to the mayor, look, you can activate the private industry council resources. You can activate community-based organizations, mental health organizations, secular and faith-based organizations. You can bring a lot of people to the table, and not to speak of the the authority that the mayor has over the police department. So I think that inherent here is a government actor, whether it's a single parole officer or a mayor who takes the initiative to weave things together. So having said that, the remaining questions, just to throw out, what about juvenile offender issues? Where do we find information on reentry courts? Very important question. Several people asked about reentry courts. How do you do it? Where do you get started? Where do you find it? How about community-based mental health programs? Who brings them to the table? They have huge resources that they can bring about. How about this wraparound philosophy? Where do we go to get more information on the wraparound philosophy? And then, Maureen, when you close, a lot of technical questions about, tell me again how I get to these slides. So let's do Jeremy, Terry, Georgia, and then Maureen, if you would close it up with Jim, we'd appreciate it. Jeremy.
I'll leave the reentry court to Terry, but let me just talk again about the importance of the mayor, and I see the mayor's, plural, the mayor's involvement here as a very important new development in thinking about reentry. And we have a number of mayors who have created a reentry council or reentry task force. Mayor Campbell from Cleveland has nominated reentry as one of her top 3 priorities. Mayor Daley in Chicago has appointed a reentry liaison and created a reentry policy group. Mayor Brown in Oakland, California, has, as much as you did, Steve, recognized that he was, as governor, the one who ended indeterminate sentencing in the state, and now as mayor of a city that's affected by reentry, sees all these people coming back to his city unprepared and wants to use this as a major way to reduce crime. So mayoral leadership is, for me, very important. It's an important new development. The Conference of Mayors has taken on this issue. It was a highlight of a recent conference of theirs. So the mayor can marshal existing resources, just the way Terry said. I think the first exercise for anybody to do is imagine we have no new resources. Don't immediately go running to the federal government or a foundation, but just say, how can we marshal existing resources to do this work much better? And that requires local leadership, political leadership. And then beyond the governmental resources, there's marshaling private resources so that we get the faith community involved, we get the business sector involved. And again, that's a uniquely local responsibility that no one but the mayor can exercise. And third, the public safety dimensions of this, we cannot escape the responsibility that mayors have for leadership to try to continue to bring crime rates down. We have this fascinating phenomenon, which is as crime rates have gone down and the number of people coming out of prison has gone up, the share of crime and the share of arrests that can be attributed to people coming out of prison is the highest it's ever been in our country. It's just the simple math. It's not that the people coming out of prison are more dangerous than any previous cohort earlier in our history. The recidivism rate is not much different. But it's because there are so many coming out of prison and the crime rates are so low that this is an opportunity for local leadership to say, if we reduce the failure rate of this cohort coming out of prison by marshaling local resources, housing and drug treatment and jobs and all the like, we have really an opportunity in this country to reduce crime rates by focusing on an identifiable population where we know when they're coming out, we know when they're coming back, and if we don't plan for it, shame on us. So the mayor is uniquely positioned, in my view, to take that leadership role.
I would agree with everything that Jeremy said. There's no question about it. The mayor, actually in the Fort Wayne model, was the very first one that convened the meeting. He had no idea, nor did anyone else in the room, including myself, have any idea that reentry was going to end up being the focus of the discussion as to how to deal with the crime issue in that one particular quadrant. They do have the authority to deal with the one and most basic need in our society, and that's safety. That's why people come together. That's why people live in towns and communities. They want safety. And when that doesn't present itself, they have every right to go back to the first person in charge, and that is the mayor. I think the one thing I would caution here, and this is pretty important, because the mayor, and luckily that's exactly how it happened in Fort Wayne, but elsewhere also, the mayor is a convener. He controls only a limited amount of resources. The county systems in most states and communities are very important. That's where your mental health, that's where sometimes your education resources, your employment resources, your welfare resources, your housing resources, they come through state and county systems. And so convening the opposite numbers as far as the decision makers cannot be understated. You must kind of go into this with a level of humility and willingness to open the opportunity up for everyone to own this problem. And that's not an easy thing to do, but I'm afraid everybody does own a piece of the problem. The other problem that I think can be addressed very quickly by mayors, and that is the information about the problem. I talked a little bit about the Fort Wayne experience with regard to statistics and mapping. I cannot emphasize enough that between corrections and the local law enforcement community and the county systems, you can map in a very clear and I think very demonstrable way what the nature of the problem is, where it is, if it's growing, and clearly where it's going to be in the next 2 to 3 to 5 years. Because what every community can do right now is get the names, addresses, street numbers of everybody who's going to be coming out over the next 10 years from prison and where they're going to be coming back to. That's well known. As a matter of fact, they can take a look at the past 10 years and match up those names, addresses, and phone numbers with whom they've arrested in the meantime. That will speak volumes as to what the dimensions of this problem happen to be. Finally, the last thing that we seem to overlook, we've talked about some of the needs these offenders present, particularly in the ability to read, particularly in the ability to have job skills that are at least somewhat competitive in the community. We must remember they probably have had early failure. If you take a look at the background and the records of all these offenders, which most people don't do, unfortunately, except maybe parole to some degree, you will find early failure, early delinquency. You will find probably many have dropped out. I would suggest most of the reading difficulties, which is usually the beginning of it, the just basic ability to understand and read and have core skills, the most minimal core skills. You look back at the elementary education these people didn't receive, and that speaks to the problem. So when you look at the problem on a community-based level, you must ask yourself, how are we going to respond to this problem, and where are these people coming from? Well, those people are right in our community right now in most cases, and they're failing in public and private school systems, and that's where you want to try to intervene and start making changes. these are not hidden problems. They're very, very open. And that's why when the mayor convenes, as I think he should, and speak to the problem, school superintendent ought to be there as well as all the other service makers and start looking at both intervention and rehabilitation, but also prevention, because it quickly turns into a crime problem within about the first juvenile delinquent era, probably in ages of 10 and 12, and you start to see a person developing a record that will eventually lead them to prison unless there's an intervention somewhere down the line or a prevention issue somewhere down the line.
Georgia here. I want to pick up on what you were just saying, Terry, about how you'll see early failure and delinquency. I think you will also see early trauma around the same time that you see the evidence of failure and perhaps the beginning of delinquency, and that is one of the places where community-based mental health programs could be brought in to provide support and hopefully support people so that they're developing on a more positive path than they would be without the support. I would note that there is tremendous stigma against using mental health services. We hear this from women who come to us for help all the time, and often they need a lot of support around the idea of using mental health services before they're open to the idea that a psychiatrist or another mental health professional could be useful in their lives and is something about which they don't have to feel terribly stigmatized. So supporting people early on when they're starting to have failure in school and to try to explore what is going on that is contributing to these failures and delinquencies, in addition to working with people as they're coming out and trying to get them to recognize that they could feel better and have a little better control and management of emotional situations, and that they could get that kind of help through accessing mental health services, does really go a long way to help people be more stable. But that we have to provide support to people around the idea and get them ready for using mental health services, because I know that the services are available and that they're paid for through the medical reimbursement system largely, but getting people to the door is the hard part. So we could do a lot better at, when we see early signs of problems, looking for other ways to intervene in addition to perhaps the criminal justice response.
Thank you, Ms. Lerner, and this is Jim Cooney again, and I would just like to quickly remind everybody that how to access the archives event and the discussion forum. But first, thank you to all of our speakers today and to all support staff for making this event a success. Thank you to all of our attendees for coming and participating. I'm now just going to quickly walk you through how to access the recording of this event, and then after that I'm going to show you how to access the discussion forum. As you see, I'm on the Government Innovators Network. That's one place that you can get the recording of this event. You can also do it via KnowledgePlex. Rather than go to that site, I will just tell you that both of them look very, very similar, especially this toolbar that you're seeing on the left side of the screen. They almost look identical on both KnowledgePlex and the Government Innovators Network. And you're going to want to go to Expert Chats, and you'll click on that and you'll get this screen, and you'll see a description of the event, and you're going to want to go to the bottom of the screen, and that's where you're going to find the recorded version of this event and the slides included with that. To go back to our home page, if you want to access the discussion forum, that's in the Government Innovators Network website, and you're going to go to the discussion boards toolbar, click that, and you'll see a list of discussion forums there. There's 4 there right now. You're going to want to go to the bottom one, Prisoner Reentry, and all you'll do is click on that. There's no topics in there yet, but by tomorrow, hopefully, there will be some new topics in there. And you can either post a new topic, or you can join conversations that are already in progress and post replies to that. And with that, I think we're going to sign off. Thanks again to all of our speakers and to the attendees. This is a great event, and thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you, and you're very welcome.
Thanks. Bye-bye.